My name is Blanche. I'm 67 years old, and I'm sitting here in my favorite rocking chair on the front porch of the Memphis Ranch looking out over 800 acres of the most beautiful Montana land God ever created. 3 weeks ago, my own son Thomas walked into this very house and handed me a $15,000 check, telling me to pack my bags and find somewhere far away to live because he'd sold my $4 million ranch right out from under me. I laughed, took that check, and let him think he'd won the biggest victory of his life. What that foolish boy had no idea about was the legal trap I'd been setting for him for over 2 years. Before we dive into this story about betrayal, revenge, and sweet justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because you're about to hear how one underestimated old woman taught her greedy son the most expensive lesson money can't buy. The story of the Memphis Ranch begins back in 1985 when I inherited these 800 acres from my parents who'd worked this land since the 1930s. Rolling green pastures stretched as far as the eye could see, perfect grazing land for cattle and fertile soil for growing the finest wheat Montana had ever produced. My late husband Robert and I spent the next 40 years of our lives transforming that modest inheritance into something truly special, building it from a simple family farm into one of the most successful cattle operations in 3 counties. Those early years were filled with nothing but hope and hard work. We had 2 beautiful children who completed our perfect little world. Thomas was born in 1982, a bright-eyed boy with sandy brown hair who seemed to have ranching in his blood from the moment he could walk. Sarah came along 3 years later, in 85, a sweet little girl who loved animals almost as much as she loved helping people. I can still picture Thomas as a 5-year-old wearing tiny cowboy boots and following me around the ranch like a devoted shadow. He'd insist on helping with every chore from feeding chickens to collecting eggs, always asking a million questions about how everything worked. Mama, why do the cows eat grass all day? When will the baby calves learn to walk? Can I help you milk Bessie tomorrow morning? His enthusiasm was infectious and made even the hardest days feel like adventures. Summer evenings were pure magic during those golden years. The whole family would pile into our old blue pickup truck after finishing the day's work and drive down to the creek that ran along the southern border of our property. Robert would teach Thomas how to cast a fishing line while Sarah picked wildflowers to make bouquets for the kitchen table. We'd spread out worn quilts and share sandwiches while planning the next day's projects and dreaming about expanding the herd. Thomas grew up understanding every inch of that land like it was written in his DNA. By age 12, he could identify which pastures needed rotating for optimal grazing spot signs of illness in cattle before the symptoms became obvious, and predict when the wheat fields would be ready for harvest just by examining the grain heads. During high school, he'd wake up at 4:30 every morning to help with chores before catching the school bus, never complaining about missing sleep or social activities. But college changed something fundamental in my son's character. He went off to study business administration at Montana State University and came back during breaks with all sorts of ideas about modernizing operations and maximizing profit margins. The boy who used to love getting dirt under his fingernails started talking about efficiency models and return on investment like the ranch was just numbers on a spreadsheet instead of a living, breathing legacy. Sarah chose a completely different path that took her away from ranch life altogether. She'd always been drawn to caring for others, so nursing school felt like a natural fit for her compassionate nature. After graduation, she moved to Seattle to work at a major hospital, visiting home for holidays, but making it clear that city life suited her better than rural Montana. I respected her decision to follow her dreams, even though it meant having less family support nearby. The first real tragedy that shattered our perfect world came without warning in December of 2018. Robert was out checking fence posts on a cold morning when he suffered a massive stroke that killed him before the ambulance could reach our remote location. Suddenly, I found myself completely alone on 800 acres with nobody but seasonal hired hands to help manage an operation that required constant attention and decision-making. After Robert's funeral, Thomas started making much more frequent trips home from Denver, claiming he wanted to help his grieving mother cope with the overwhelming responsibility of running such a large ranch operation. At first, I felt genuinely grateful for his concern and support during the most difficult period of my life. However, it didn't take long for me to notice that something felt fundamentally different about my son's attitude toward the place where he'd grown up. The most dramatic change came when Thomas married Jessica in the spring of 2019. She was a 28-year-old blonde socialite from a wealthy Denver family who'd never worked a real job in her pampered life. Her father owned multiple real estate development companies, and she'd grown up attending charity galas instead of learning the value of honest labor. From the very first moment Jessica stepped foot on the Memphis ranch, I could tell she viewed our rural lifestyle as something primitive and backwards. Jessica complained constantly about every aspect of ranch living. The smell of cattle manure offended her delicate sensibilities. The sound of roosters crowing at dawn disrupted what she called her necessary beauty sleep. She refused to walk anywhere near the barns because she might get mud on her expensive designer shoes. During family dinners, she'd make snide remarks about how our simple farmhouse felt like camping in the wilderness instead of civilized living. Most heartbreaking of all, Thomas started agreeing with her criticisms, instead of defending the life that had shaped him into the man he'd become. The son who used to brag about ranch life to his college friends was now apologizing for our old-fashioned ways and primitive accommodations. That's when the pressure campaign began in earnest. Thomas would corner me for what he called serious conversations about my future, always with this fake, concerned expression that made my skin crawl. "Mom, you're pushing 70 years old," he'd say while shaking his head sadly. "This place is way too much work for one woman to handle alone. Maybe it's time to start thinking seriously about downsizing before something terrible happens." My response was always swift and firm. "This ranch is my entire life, Thomas. Your father and I built this operation with our own two hands over 40 years of blood, sweat, and tears. I'm not ready to give up on everything we accomplished together just because you think I'm getting too old to handle responsibility." But Thomas kept pushing harder constantly, bringing up my age and supposed declining health like I was some senile invalid who couldn't make rational decisions about my own property. He'd cite statistics about farming accidents among elderly people and horror stories about seniors who'd been injured trying to maintain large properties without adequate help. Jessica made her feelings crystal clear during our monthly family dinners. She'd interrupt conversations to make pointed comments about what she considered the wasted potential of our beautiful land. "Just imagine what someone could accomplish with all this gorgeous acreage," she'd tell Thomas right in front of me as if I weren't sitting at my own dinner table. "A luxury resort would be absolutely perfect here, or maybe some high-end vacation cabins for wealthy city folks who want to experience authentic Western living without actually roughing it." I began noticing disturbing changes in Thomas's behavior during his visits. He'd spend hours walking around the property with his cell phone, taking photographs of different sections like he was documenting something important for future reference. When I asked about his sudden interest in ranch photography, he'd brush off my questions with vague explanations about updating insurance records or creating family memories. Even more suspicious were the private phone conversations he'd have while walking around the perimeter of our land. He'd speak in low whispers and always end these calls quickly whenever I approached. Something in his secretive behavior triggered alarm bells that had been dormant since his childhood when he'd try to hide broken household items or poor report cards. My growing suspicions finally pushed me to take action that would reveal the full scope of my son's betrayal. I'd raised Thomas for 38 years and I knew all his tells when he was hiding something important from me. While he and Jessica were in town one afternoon supposedly shopping for groceries, I made the decision to search through his belongings in the bedroom he used during visits home. What I discovered hidden beneath a stack of financial magazines made my blood run cold and my hands shake with rage. Thomas had been carrying around preliminary contracts and correspondence with Davidson Development Corporation, a major real estate company based out of Billings. According to these detailed documents, my son had already negotiated the sale of 600 acres of prime ranch land for exactly $4.2 million. The development plans were laid out in shocking detail. Davidson intended to build a luxury resort and spa on the choicest sections of our property, complete with vacation cabins, a golf course, and facilities for wealthy tourists who wanted to experience romanticized Western living without any actual work or hardship. Thomas and Jessica planned to keep the remaining 200 acres for themselves, building a modern house and offering guided trail rides for resort guests. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Hidden in the same folder were email exchanges between Thomas and Jessica's father discussing exactly how they planned to handle what they referred to as the old lady problem. They wanted to have me declared mentally incompetent and placed in an assisted living facility for my own safety and well-being, clearing the way for Thomas to take control of all ranch assets. The cruelest revelation came in printed emails that showed the true depth of my son's callousness. In one message dated just 3 months earlier, Thomas had written to Jessica, "The old lady won't live much longer anyway based on family history. We just need to wait for the right moment to make our move. without causing too much family drama. Jessica's response was equally heartless. My father says the development permits and environmental studies will take at least 6 months to complete, so we need her out of the way well before construction can begin. The lawyers think a guardianship proceeding would be the cleanest approach if she won't cooperate voluntarily. Reading those cold, calculated words from my own son felt like being stabbed in the heart with a rusty knife. This was the little boy I'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, the teenager I'd nursed through pneumonia while staying awake for 3 straight nights, the young man I'd helped pay for college because Robert and I wanted him to have opportunities we'd never enjoyed. The final piece of evidence was perhaps the most legally damaging. Thomas had been practicing my signature and had already created several forged documents giving himself power of attorney over my financial affairs. The forgeries were surprisingly good, but not perfect enough to fool a handwriting expert or survive serious legal scrutiny. Instead of confronting Thomas immediately about his treachery, I made a strategic decision that would prove crucial in the coming battle. If my son wanted to play games involving deception and fraudulent legal documents, then I'd beat him at his own game by thinking several moves ahead. I contacted my longtime attorney, Margaret Foster, who'd been handling family legal matters for over 15 years, and told her we needed to discuss emergency asset protection strategies. My next call was to a private investigator who specialized in documenting fraud cases. If Thomas thought he could steal my life's work through forgery and manipulation, he was about to learn that underestimating his mother's intelligence would be the costliest mistake of his entire life. The morning I'd been dreading finally arrived on a crisp October day when autumn leaves were just beginning to turn gold and red across the Montana landscape. Thomas and Jessica appeared at my front door, accompanied by a stern-looking man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as their attorney, Richard Maxwell, from a prestigious Billings law firm. I invited them into the living room where Robert and I had shared thousands of peaceful evenings over 4 decades of marriage, never imagining this beloved space would become the setting for such devastating family betrayal. Thomas sat forward in his chair with his hands clasped together, putting on the concerned expression he'd been practicing for months. "Mom, we need to have a very serious conversation about your future and what's best for everyone involved." He began with rehearsed words that sounded like they'd been scripted by his lawyer. "Jessica and I have been discussing your situation at length, and we've reached some difficult conclusions about your living arrangements here at the ranch." Before I could respond or ask questions, Thomas continued with his prepared speech. "The truth is, you're getting too old to safely manage this large operation by yourself. We're worried about your health and safety, and we think it's time for you to consider alternative housing arrangements that would be more appropriate for someone in your position." Then came the bombshell that knocked the wind out of my lungs. "We've sold the ranch, Mom. The new owners are paying $4 million for the property, and they want to take possession within 30 days. This decision is for your own good because you simply can't handle the physical and financial responsibilities of this place anymore." Jessica sat there with a satisfied smirk, clearly relishing what she thought was my moment of complete defeat. The lawyer shuffled through paperwork like this was just another routine business transaction instead of the complete destruction of everything I'd worked for since 1985. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cashier's check made out in my name. "Here's $15,000 to help you get settled in a new place somewhere far from here, where you won't have to worry about all these ranch responsibilities that have become too much for you to handle." The casual cruelty in his voice was absolutely breathtaking. 40 years of backbreaking work, financial sacrifice, and careful stewardship reduced to a $15,000 farewell payment like I was some hired hand being let go after a seasonal job. The check felt like an insult wrapped in false generosity. Jessica couldn't contain her glee any longer. "See, Thomas? I told you she'd be reasonable once she understood the reality of her situation. Your mother is smart enough to recognize that progress sometimes requires difficult decisions, even when they're emotionally challenging. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to fight back, to unleash 40 years of accumulated fury on these 2 ungrateful thieves who were trying to steal my legacy. Instead, I shocked them completely by laughing softly and accepting the check without protest. Well, I suppose you boys know what's best for business matters. You've obviously put a lot of thought into this plan." Thomas looked genuinely surprised that I wasn't putting up the fierce resistance he'd been expecting. "Mom, are you sure you're okay with this? I thought you might be upset about leaving the ranch after all these years." I smiled calmly and folded the check, slipping it into my apron pocket. "When do I need to be moved out completely?" 2 weeks should give you plenty of time to pack your personal belongings and arrange for somewhere else to live, Jessica answered quickly, as if she'd been waiting for this question. The new owners are very eager to begin implementing their development plans for the property. As they prepared to leave, looking pleased with their easy victory, Jessica turned back with fake sympathy, dripping from every word. Don't worry about this change, Mrs. Henderson. Sometimes these transitions work out better than we expect. Maybe you'll discover that you actually enjoy city living more than you think you will. Thomas nodded along eagerly, clearly relieved that his difficult mother had been so cooperative about losing everything she'd ever cared about. We'll check on you in a few days to see how the packing is going and if you need help finding a suitable apartment in town. The moment their car disappeared down our gravel driveway, I walked to the phone with a smile spreading across my face for the first time in months. I picked up the kitchen telephone and dialed Margaret Foster's number with steady hands and a heart full of righteous determination. Margaret, this is Blanche Henderson calling. I have been expecting this day for exactly 2 years, and now it's time to activate the legal strategy we discussed. Margaret's voice was confident and reassuring on the other end of the line. Blanche, are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with the full plan? Once we file these papers and contact the authorities, there won't be any possibility of turning back or keeping this matter private. I described exactly what had just transpired in my living room, how my own son had handed me a $15,000 check like I was some charity case he was helping out of pity. They think they've outsmarted a foolish old woman, Margaret. It's time to show them who they're really dealing with. The truth that Thomas had no knowledge of was both simple and absolutely devastating for his fraudulent plans. Back in early 2020, right after I first started noticing his suspicious behavior and secretive phone calls, I'd quietly moved 75% of my total assets into something called the Blanche Family Trust, a legal structure that protected everything valuable from potential fraud or manipulation. According to the carefully crafted trust documents, the ranch property, all cattle and equipment, the main house, and most of my financial accounts were legally owned by the trust rather than by me personally. Thomas was listed as co-trustee, but that position only became active after my death or if I was declared mentally incompetent by a court of law. Since I was obviously still sharp as a tack and making my own decisions, he had absolutely zero authority to sell anything. Every signature Thomas had forged on those Davidson development contracts was therefore completely fraudulent and legally worthless. The sale he thought he'd completed was actually a federal crime involving elder abuse forgery of legal documents and interstate fraud since Davidson was headquartered in a different state. My next phone call was to Sarah in Seattle, and her reaction was exactly what I'd hoped to hear from my honest daughter. Mom, I cannot believe Thomas would stoop to something this low. I always knew he was ambitious and money-focused, but I never imagined he'd actually steal from his own mother. What can I do to help you fight this? Margaret Foster had been preparing for this exact scenario for 2 years. We already had fraud charges ready to file documentation of forged signatures and evidence of Thomas's abuse of power of attorney. The criminal case would be airtight because we'd been collecting evidence since the first time I discovered his suspicious activities. The FBI became very interested when Margaret contacted them about a case involving interstate fraud, forged legal documents, and elder financial abuse. According to the agent she spoke with, these types of crimes were becoming increasingly common as adult children tried to steal their parents' assets before natural inheritance could occur. Davidson Development Corporation started getting extremely nervous when they received legal notices about potential fraud in their property transaction. No legitimate business wants to be associated with stolen land deals, especially when federal investigators start asking pointed questions about due diligence and document verification. Within 48 hours of Thomas thinking he'd achieved the greatest victory of his life, multiple government agencies were building criminal cases that would send him to federal prison for several years. The son who thought he'd outsmarted his aging mother was about to learn that wisdom and patience often triumph over greed and arrogance. Exactly 1 week after Thomas walked out of my house believing he'd successfully stolen my life's work, reality crashed down on him like an avalanche of legal consequences he'd never seen coming. The phone call I'd been anticipating came at 7:30 in the morning, and I could hear the panic in my son's voice before he even finished saying hello. Mom, something terrible is happening, and I don't understand what went wrong, Thomas said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fear. Davidson Development is saying our sale contract is completely invalid. They're threatening to sue me for misrepresentation and fraud. Their lawyers are demanding I return their earnest money plus damages for wasted time and resources. I let him suffer in confused silence for several seconds before delivering the news that would change the trajectory of his entire life. Oh, honey, did you really believe I was too old and stupid to protect myself from my own son's greed? Did you honestly think I'd just sit back and let you steal everything your father and I built together? Thomas tried to interrupt with desperate questions, but I wasn't finished educating him about the consequences of underestimating his mother. I moved everything into a family trust 2 years ago when I first noticed your suspicious behavior and secretive phone conversations. You never had any legal authority to sell even 1 square inch of this ranch. The silence on the phone was so complete, I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Thomas found his voice, though it came out as a pathetic whisper. But, Mom, what about the power of attorney documents? I have legal authority to handle your affairs? I couldn't help laughing at his pitiful attempt to justify criminal behavior. Those forged signatures you created are federal felonies, Thomas. The FBI is building a case against you for elder abuse fraud and document forgery. They're also very interested in Jessica's father and his company's role in this conspiracy. The next few days brought a cascade of legal disasters that destroyed every aspect of Thomas's comfortable life. Jessica's world began falling apart when her father realized the fraud case could potentially implicate his own real estate empire. Successful businessmen don't want to be associated with elder abuse and forged contracts, especially when federal investigators start examining their business practices. Within 2 weeks of his imaginary victory, Thomas was facing multiple felony charges that could result in 5 years in federal prison. The local district attorney was particularly interested in prosecuting elder abuse cases as examples for other potential criminals who might target vulnerable seniors. Sarah flew home from Seattle immediately to support me during the legal proceedings and to witness her brother's spectacular downfall. Mom, I'm so proud of you for standing up to Thomas and protecting what you and Dad worked so hard to build. He deserved everything he's getting. Margaret Foster's legal strategy was absolutely flawless. We had documented evidence of signature forgery, recorded phone conversations revealing the conspiracy between Thomas and Jessica, email evidence of their cruel planning, and testimony from multiple witnesses who'd observed Thomas acting suspiciously around ranch property. The financial consequences for Thomas were immediate and crushing. He had to return my $15,000 check plus additional money for legal fees and damages. Davidson Development demanded substantial compensation for their wasted time, resources, and damaged reputation. Jessica filed for divorce the moment criminal charges became public knowledge, taking half of Thomas's remaining assets with her. The criminal trial was swift and decisive. Thomas's expensive lawyer tried to argue that his actions were motivated by genuine concern for his aging mother's welfare, but the recorded evidence of his callous planning made that defense laughable to the jury. When the judge sentenced Thomas to 18 months in federal prison followed by 3 years of probation, I felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction that justice had finally been served. The little boy I'd raised had made choices that led to this moment, and now he'd have plenty of time to think about the value of family loyalty. 2 years have passed since my son learned that underestimating his mother was the single most expensive mistake any person could possibly make. I'm still living in the house where Robert and I raised our children, still waking up every morning to the sound of cattle calling in the distance and roosters announcing another beautiful Montana dawn. Thomas served his full 18-month sentence in federal prison, and during that time he wrote numerous letters apologizing for his betrayal and begging for my forgiveness. Prison apparently gave him considerable time to reflect on what truly matters in life, though I sometimes wonder whether his remorse comes from genuine regret or simply from the consequences of getting caught. I've learned through this painful experience that forgiveness and wisdom are not the same thing. I can forgive my son for his greed and deception while still remembering the valuable lessons that betrayal taught me about human nature. Trust is like my grandmother's finest china, beautiful and precious when intact, but once it's been shattered, the cracks always remain visible even after careful repair. Sarah made the wonderful decision to move back to Montana permanently to help me manage ranch operations and to be closer to family during these golden years of my life. Working alongside my daughter has brought unexpected joy and purpose to what could have been a lonely period of widowhood. She understands the importance of preserving what previous generations built through honest labor and sacrifice. The Memphis Ranch will be properly protected for future generations through comprehensive estate planning that prevents anyone from attempting fraud or theft. Margaret Foster helped me create multiple layers of legal protection that safeguard the property while ensuring it stays in the hands of family members who truly understand its value. Through this experience, I've discovered that age brings a special kind of wisdom about human character that younger people haven't had enough time to develop. We seniors have witnessed enough of life cycles to recognize patterns of behavior that might fool less experienced observers. Sometimes the greatest gift of growing older is learning to trust our instincts about people's true motivations. My story, unfortunately, isn't unique in today's world. Elder financial abuse happens far more frequently than most people realize, and it's often perpetrated by family members who believe they're entitled to inheritances before their parents pass away naturally. I want other seniors watching this to know that we don't have to be victims just because society sometimes treats gray hair and wrinkles as signs of helplessness. The truth is that many of us older folks have spent decades accumulating not just financial assets, but also wisdom, patience, and strategic thinking abilities that can be powerful weapons when deployed correctly. Never underestimate an elderly person who's had time to observe, plan, and prepare for potential threats to everything they've worked to build. The Memphis Ranch still stretches across 800 acres of the most beautiful grassland Montana has to offer. The cattle still graze peacefully in pastures that have been carefully maintained for generations. The wheat still grows tall and golden in fields that have fed countless families, and I still feel profoundly grateful every single day for the strength and wisdom that surviving betrayal has given me. Some people might think I was too harsh in my treatment of Thomas, but I believe that real consequences are the only way people learn to respect boundaries and other people's rights. If I had simply forgiven his theft without legal action, he might have tried the same criminal behavior with other vulnerable people. The ranch is still here, the land is still productive and beautiful, and I still wake up every morning thankful for the hard-earned wisdom that comes with age and experience. Some of life's most valuable lessons cost more than we'd like to pay, but the most important ones usually do require significant sacrifice. Have any of you experienced family members who tried to take advantage of your trust and generosity? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below because sharing these experiences helps other people recognize warning signs before it's too late. Please like this video. If my story reminded you to protect yourself legally and financially, and subscribe to this channel for more stories about standing up to people who mistake kindness for weakness. Share this video with anyone who might need encouragement to fight for what's rightfully theirs. Thank you for listening to my story with such patience and attention, and may you always have the courage and wisdom to defend what you've worked so hard to build throughout your lifetime.